in the Bissett School of Business and Senior Fellow in the Institute for Community Prosperity. We have Dr. Brad Clark, Associate Professor in Broadcast and Media Studies. We have and Journalism at Mount Royal, and we also have Dr. David Legg, Professor in the Department of Health and Physical Education. All of them are co-authors of the book Implications and Impacts for Esports on Business and Society, which was published in 2019. The authors are also joined by Ryan Coutts, who is the Head of Business Development for the Alberta Esports Association, and Dr. Brad Mahon, who is the Dean of the Faculty of Continuing Education at Mount Royal University, that has recently launched an Esports Management Extension Certificate. Each of our presenters today are going to share their perspectives on esports. And as Anna said, if you've got any questions, feel free to ask questions as we're going through, or save them for the end when we can have a larger conversation. If anybody's having any technological difficulties with seeing anything today, just let us know. Feel free to raise your hand if you're familiar with how that works and you've got that plugin for Google Meets, or just take your microphone off and ask us any questions. So David, Finch, I would like to ask you if you'd like to get us started with an overview of helping us to understand what esports is.
All right. Thanks very much, Carrie. I'm hoping everyone can see my screen. Looks good. All right, perfect. Well, I'm just going to provide a little background, but David and I, when we started this initiative with Brad and several other authors,
David, what we're seeing is your screen. We're not seeing your presenter, your presentation. There we go.
How was that?
Now we've got it. Perfect. Thank you.
Perfect. All right. So when we started working on this book in 2018, it was really from the perspective of, from two perspectives. David, Legg, and I come from really a sports management, sports marketing lens, but we're also fathers of young adult boys. And we noticed their interest shifting very quickly from throwing the ball around the park to staring at other people, primarily playing video games. And so we really were interested in the business implications of this, as we started looking at some of our partners that we work with, for example, Calgary Sports Entertainment, as they start shifting at the impact of esports on their business model. My background specifically is in sponsorship marketing, so I was very interested in how this started influencing sponsor decision-making, where they were investing their dollars and how they were activating those dollars. So I'll just provide a quick background. The first conversation that we had as we worked on this book was, is it a sport? And it's a circular conversation that goes around and around and around. We've adopted, for all intents and purposes, we're looking at this definition that has been adopted and used by the IOC and others, and specifically the shifting of esports into traditional multi-sport events. The first event will be in 2022 at the Asian Games, and these are the four criteria they use. Is it physical? Are there accepted rules? Is it competitive? And does it have a global governing body? It's number 4 that historically has been the challenge for esports to actually gain traction globally in multi-sport context, because of the private and proprietary nature of the gaming. There was no governing body. But we've moved in and said, okay, if there in fact are these 4 categories of sports, and it includes again everything from motorized sports to mind games in coordination sports, then esports falls within that context as a sport. Now, just a walk down memory lane, where does esports come from and where is it going? Well, fundamentally, to understand esports, you've got to really go back to the origins of video games, which go back as far as Pong in 1972. And you saw the evolution of competitive gaming. The first recorded, quote unquote, esports tournament was recorded in 1997. So what we saw in the early 90s was what were called LAN parties, where obviously PCs emerged, different types of gaming emerged. And because of the lack of high-speed connectivity, people had to co-locate in a LAN environment, and then they would play each other. So there was a window there of almost a decade in which LAN parties, because of network connectivity issues, were really the primary medium for delivering esports. But when Xbox launched in 2004, which was the first internet-connected gaming console, we started seeing an explosion of different esports platforms and games. And you see the growth over the last 15 years that has led to the emergence of obviously platforms across a range of different gaming genres that continues to grow. What we've seen move most recently in an area that we were particularly interested in, we've done a couple studies on, is the NBA's movement into launching a fourth league. And their fourth league is exclusively oriented around the NBA 2K platform that they use, but they've created essentially shadow esports teams that run in parallel to about 2/3 of their current franchises. One of the studies we did, one of our students in the original launch of the NBA 2K interviewed about half the general managers in the leagues. And it was a fascinating example of how they were looking at the synergies of their existing business model of an NBA team and how they could extend that to appeal to greater fans and more sponsors by extending their reach through esports. Now, I always like to use this particular slide to provide those who aren't familiar with gaming, just the context of gaming. What this is a reflection of what we call opening weekends. So if video games were an opening weekend, which is a common, prior to the pandemic, was a common metric to judge the impact and success of feature films in cinema, Avengers Endgame ranks #1 for the opening weekend at $1.2 billion. But the next three are video games. And this just provides context on the reach and scope of this sector, that it in fact is now trumping and moving far beyond many other entertainment platforms. So that's why when you look at gaming and you look at esports specifically, it's impossible not to look at the broader space. So, what we often see in the media is that center circle, and that's essentially elite and professional esport participants. And our estimation is when we did the study was there were about 27,000 professionals. And David and we'll talk about when they enter and the age, but they are entering at a very, very young age into the professional ranks, certainly many of them before the age of 10. The next range, what we move out to is start looking at esports competitors. So that is not obviously professionals, but those are people who compete in esport tournaments or leagues. And it expands to the full gamut outside, and the 2.2 billion is now significantly beyond that. But it's the reach of gaming as a whole that makes the center of this bullseye the most valuable part, because that is a potential market reach, not just for the leagues and the publishers, but for the sponsors and partners who want to reach literally a quarter of the world and growing. One of the things when we studied esports and looked at its lucrative nature from a partner's perspective and why it has such a unique position in the marketplace is we studied this, what we call the dual role. And the dual role were people who participated as well as people who observed or watched. And what this looks at is a ratio of a variety of different sports and esports, and the ratio between those who actually play the game and those who watch the game. So again, if you look at, for example, on soccer, which is about the only one where you're looking at some reach, what you're seeing in the soccer or football world is you're looking at a major event. I believe we looked at World Cup television ratings at this stage. But you're looking at a very, very close relationship between the number of people who play the game of soccer and who watch the game of soccer. Now, what you look at when you move to Fortnite as an example is in fact an inversion, where you're looking at 250 million people who play the game and very few people who watch it currently. And Brad Clark will talk about the broadcast potential. The gap here is opportunity. When you start looking at the gap in the esports world between those who understand it and play it and they're not yet watching it, because that gap speaks to the addressable market. If you're a potential business partner or sponsor, the ability to start looking at the extension of viewership across a variety of different platforms and how that can be monetized. Where it also becomes very different from a marketing perspective is, if you want to, you're a golfer. David Legg and I are hitting the ball at Kananaskis. We're not playing Pebble Beach, or we're not playing Augusta. But in the esports world, the people playing it are playing on the identical platform as the professionals. So David and I aren't playing at Pebble Beach. We're not playing at Augusta. We dream to, but we can't. But when our boys play Fortnite or League of Legends, they are playing the identical game as the professionals. And that is a game changer from an engagement perspective and an emotional attachment perspective to not only the publishers and the games, but more specifically to the athletes, as they watch their favorite athlete do exactly what they did. Again, another data point I want to raise here is the rise of winnings and purses for different sports. Again, we are looking at this from a traditional sport perspective to an esport perspective. And again, so you've got the US Open, a prize pool of about $50 million, Wimbledon about $34 million. Fortnite's prize pool as of when this was published was $100 million. So you're seeing massive movement up this curve for esports as a lucrative pathway for professional athletes that will rival and are rivaling what we would determine as the most lucrative professional areas today. Couple of more slides before I pass it on. To understand esports, you have to understand the complexity of the ecosystem. And this is where we spent a lot of our time studying, is looking at all the different players in the ecosystem. So there's publishers, there's console developers, there's sponsors, there's leagues, there's teams, there's venues. And the entire system has to work together. But when you look at the power structure of esports, and this is what this slide looks at, you look at all the different stakeholders and the way they sit. Obviously, you're looking at hundreds of millions of fans at the bottom here. Then you look at broadcasters and streaming platforms that run it. So, for example, broadcasters might be ESPN, streaming platform might be Twitch, which is owned by Amazon. Then you look at players, which are both professional as well as amateur. Again, you're into the hundreds of millions. They then move into leagues. The leagues are proprietary to a great extent. And so, for example, League of Legends, which is a game, owns and controls their league. This is where it gets very different from traditional sports. Because, for example, the NFL does not control and have intellectual property rights to the game of football, period. In esports, the publishers own their game. Therefore, they have enormous control over how the game is licensed, who's using it, and to a great extent, they can leverage disproportionate amount of power compared to almost any other sport because of the control they have with the IP. It also can lead to fairly significant evolution of the game, because you can make one coding change or one change within a game and fundamentally redefine the competitive landscape of it. That is not as easily done by changing a rule in hockey or football, but without any consultation, because these are privately owned organizations, they can change the rules of a game and fundamentally change the nature of the game. So based on that, that provides a base background on esports, its history, and some of the kind of macro level issues. And I will then pass it back to Carrie.
Thanks so much, David. That's amazing. We're over to Brad Clark now, who's going to shed some light on media agenda and some of the racial dimensions of esports.
Yeah, thanks a lot. It's great to be here. I'm going to talk about, the media landscape and diversity and inclusion. And this is really my entree into the world of esports. It aligns with my research interests, which have focused on media, social media, representations of racialized and Indigenous peoples in news media. Lately, that's taken me into exploring some of the issues with Black Lives Matter in the last while and the racial reckoning, and I'll speak to that a little bit with regard to esports media as well. So the view from high above, from 35,000 feet, when you look at esports media, and David has alluded to this, you have a landscape that in the media realm is very much dominated by the publishers. This is very much a streaming-based, digital-based universe. It's very robust. It's actually, I think, a model that is very appropriate for where media broadly and generally are going, and news media in particular struggles so much with their business model these days. I think there are a lot of lessons to be drawn from the experiences of esports media and the way they've set themselves up. And the digital streaming platforms are really the lifeblood, and that's principally Twitch, but also YouTube and Facebook and some of the other more individualized streaming platforms in some parts of the world. Twitch itself has been described as the ESPN of esports, and last time I checked, when you look at its streamers, its audience, it comes in just behind Netflix in terms of its audience, but a spot ahead of Pornhub. Although I think maybe through the pandemic, those numbers may have shifted a bit. I don't want to speculate on those particular platforms too much, but it's way, way ahead of most of the traditional terrestrial broadcasting cable networks in terms of its viewers. And Twitch is where esports fans go to see the top competitions live streamed during the actual play of the competition. They go there to find videos of events posted there as video on demand. All the publishers have channels. They're in the top 100. Pros and former athletes dominate the Twitch stream top channels as well. The content, as I say, it can be live streams of competition, but also very traditionally packaged media content of interviews with competitors, packages of analysis, things that you would see on traditional mainstream media websites like Sports Illustrated's SI.com. You also will find Twitch channels from the organizations and the media dedicated to just following, to reporting on esports as well. So .esport, Polygon, Kotaku, even ESPN has channels for esports. Although recently ESPN has sort of gotten rid of its entire editorial division dedicated to esports, although it still plans to continue with doing live broadcasts. It's very much a vertical integrated media paradigm where publishers often own the leagues, they own the games, they dominate the media content, which they'll provide either on their own websites as well as on Twitch streams or on YouTube as well. So, for example, Overwatch, which is owned by Activision Blizzard, they have this gigantic 74,000 square foot facility that used to be the home of The Tonight Show in Burbank, California. And it's 5 levels, all dedicated to producing and broadcasting esports related media, theaters and production facilities, caster booths, and the like. The model is very similar to what we see in some respects in some parts of traditional sports, where, for example, Maple Leaf Sports and Entertainment, which is owned by Rogers and BCE, is also owns the Blue Jays and the Maple Leafs and the Raptors, but also controls some of the content, obviously through Rogers networks that it owns and broadcasts. And so there's kind of this integrated model, but it's much more pervasive in esports media. The publishers they really control so much of the content, and you tend to find it on ESPN. As I say, I think this is a really robust model in a world where so much media content is switching to a digital and streaming sort of business model. But part of what's lost in the way that esports media has developed, as a former journalist, this really strikes me is kind of a lack of independence from the industry itself. So it kind of begs the question, does the lack of media independence prevent the industry from looking at some of the harder questions it has faced over time? And this takes us into the other part of the analysis I did for the book, looking at gender, race, and culture. And it's a challenging thing to get to when you're looking at a broadly international operation, which doesn't really fall along borderlines, and so it becomes challenging to try and analyze along ethnic lines, racial lines. But what we decided to do was look at Twitch, since it is kind of the face of esports, and get a sense of some of the diversity there. And what we found was that what we did was we looked at the top 100 channels to see who is streaming and what the backgrounds of those people were. Now, keep in mind that gamers, not necessarily esport, but gamers are kind of evenly split between males and females. 45 to 50% of gamers in North America are female. What we found when we looked at the top 100 streamers on Twitch, there were 72 individual accounts, and out of those 72 individual accounts, only 4 were women. Along ethnic lines, we found that 58% were white. So there's kind of a perception we had going in that this was going to be an industry that was dominated by white males, and I think that was borne out in this analysis. We also decided to look at the group accounts, which basically broke down along publishing lines and the media content associated with what they produce related to their different teams and leagues, and we looked at their casters. Those are the people who do the on-air commentary, either live or in media content segments. There were 114 individual casters in that group. Only 14 were women. There was one person who was non-binary, and so males made up 87%. When we looked at ethnicity of this group, it was diverse, but it was principally driven by diversity in the Overwatch League, which spans Asia, Europe, and Latin America. And when we took Overwatch casters out of the mix, over 84% of the casters were white. So we know that in esports generally, there are a lot fewer women competing compared to gaming. And just anecdotally looking and researching esports over the last few years, has a lot to do with kind of the toxic environment associated with gaming. There's a lot of trolling and misogyny faced by women. There's a long history there that dates back to the early days of gaming, the fallout from Gamergate. And we see in lots of esports competition, particularly in the chat, there's cyberbullying and homophobic remarks, and actually there's outright racism at times, use of the N-word either by people competing, streaming, and even by casters at times. And this has been a concern for people looking to expand into esports. The NCAA, which administers sports in college sports in the U.S., has been approached many times to consider bringing esports into the fold, but their concern over misogyny towards competitors has really made that a non-issue. I know I'm getting close to the end of my time, so I'll try and wrap up here with just a quick look at with Black Lives Matter and the racial reckoning we saw through the pandemic in 2020. And there were lots of nods to to supporting social justice with donations and statements of support, but there was a feeling in among the esports community that perhaps there wasn't enough done, or that the industry didn't take advantage to the extent that it possibly could have, and we still see that there are issues going on. Just last month, Apex Legend introduced a Black Lives Matter badge to commemorate Black History Month, and it was met with lots of derision and criticism, and people posting things like White Lives Matter too. So to sort of wrap up, I would say that while the esports industry really works to try and improve diversity and to address the issues that it faces, there still seems to be quite a long ways to go.
Thank you so much, Brad. I really appreciate that. We're over to David Legg now to share some light on health and wellness. Thank you.
Thank you, Carrie, and thank you, Anna, for the invitation to participate in this. It's obviously a fascinating topic. It's certainly pertinent. It's certainly relevant. So I'm happy to participate. So the chapter, as you alluded to, that I was responsible for, focused on health and wellness, and as a physical educator professionally myself, that was certainly aligned with it. I will admit I went into it again, perhaps somewhat naively and not with a fulsome understanding of it. I don't want to say I had a bias towards the negative, and it's interesting just listening to Brad and David Finch talk about it. I think there is an inclination, for instance, to look at esport from the negative side almost immediately. But like a lot of the issues that Brad raised, as it related to misogyny and racism, like that's, and I'm not excusing esport to this, but that's happening in all sports, and so it's not just necessarily isolated to esport. And a lot of the things that I looked at when I was focusing on the health and wellness elements of esport, I think naturally initially started looking at the sedentary behaviors of individuals that were playing the games, the unique ailments that came out, whether it was early onset osteoarthritis in the thumb joint, for young people, like like similar issues as it relates to to older adults, that with the hunched shoulders. And as I'm saying that, I'm starting to sit a bit more straight, just even on at my desk. But there's also some positive elements too, and hopefully I'll try to provide a balanced perspective on both the pros and the cons from a health perspective as it relates to esport. It's interesting. It's only been in 2018 where the World Health Organization actually named what they called gaming disorder, and people jumped on that, and that combined with what people were also referring to as exercise deficiency disorder. But that the gaming disorder piece was really only identified and limited to a very, very, very small percentage of individuals who were participating within what we would define as esport. As we looked at it more closely, we really looked at kind of two separate issues as it related to the health and the wellness of people that participated in esport. And the first was the physiology, so the biology side of it. And I've made mention to a couple of these things already, but for instance, blood clots, deep vein thrombosis, leading to pulmonary embolisms and stuff like that, that people might experience from sitting on long plane rides, as an example, were being experienced by people who played esport. But these were, again, not necessarily common, but they were examples of issues because of just the long sitting nature of participating. Issues related to eyesight, I thought, was an interesting one. In particular, the overindulgence of blue light, and then the decrease of melatonin, which then impacted sleep patterns. And so there were health issues again related to that. But you could arguably make the same case about sitting in front of a laptop, Zoom call after Zoom call after Zoom call every day. And so again, we're not immune to those same issues. On the positive side, I think there's an interesting opportunity with esport, and it's the gateway side of things. And there are certainly examples of, Swift being an example. Peloton, you could argue, is, kind of bordering on that esport component. The Wii gaming consoles, where people were actually physically manipulating, different things in order to play online games. I even think about, as I was traveling through Europe a few years ago, you would go into the train stations. In order to charge your phones, you would sit at an exercise bike, and you would pedal the bike, and that ultimately would charge your iPhone. So I think there's lots of opportunities to cross over with a physical activity and the electronic version of it. David Finch was making reference to playing golf and not being able to play Pebble Beach or Augusta. However, Paris 2024, for hosting the Olympic and Paralympic Games, they're going to provide an opportunity for every person through virtual reality to actually run the marathon. And so again, there's an opportunity to use esports as a mechanism through that virtual reality to participate and to see just how slow you would be with running against Olympic and Paralympic athletes in a marathon condition. And so you could see that could then take the next step where individuals through esport are able to participate. I think about the opportunities for people, for instance, who have disabilities to participate in physical activities or activities with their peer group. Certainly Microsoft, Google, and Xbox have done a lot of work on trying to enable that sense of inclusion and belonging to participate in physical activities. So lots of benefits in that respect. The other aspect to the health and wellness is the more mental, the mental wellness, and concerns over addiction. And I think those are fair. Concerns over bullying, concerns over segregation and minimizing people. Again, I think these are all concerns that should be addressed and considered. But headlines, I think, sometimes perhaps make it seem more worse than it is. So I came across a headline that talked about Fortnite leading to divorce in the UK. And, it made reference to that there were 200 cases where in specific court documents, people had made reference to their addiction to playing Fortnite, which then led to the demise of the marriage. Now, so is Fortnite creating an epidemic of divorce in the UK? I would hasten to think that that's actually true, but because it was mentioned 200 times, and in the year before it was never mentioned. But of course, Fortnite as a game itself is still a relatively new phenomenon. So I think it's a little early to identify that it's leading to an increase in divorce rates among married couples in the UK. But I want to come back just to kind of finish off with this idea of that sense of belonging. And certainly, we're speaking from a university context here, and you think about our own students. And I've had these conversations with individuals who work in our, Cougars athletics and recreation context. And, our students are interested in gaming. Our students are interested in esport, and we can continue to offer the traditional activities and events that my generation enjoyed playing. But if they're not coming, David Finch as the marketer would attest to this. Like if people aren't buying what we're selling, then we have to do perhaps a different job of marketing to them or offering a slightly different service. And I think through esport, there is an opportunity to connect with students, have them feel a sense of belonging to our institution, have them feel a sense of a kind of a collective and a community that perhaps they're not getting in another way, but they are able to access that through the online format through esports. So again, it's perhaps almost that gateway drug. Maybe that's not the right analogy, but to encourage them to get more involved in other physical activities and other ways of connecting to our institution. So I'll stop there for now, and I certainly would happy to engage in the question and answers, but I'll turn it back to you, Carrie. Thank you.
Thanks, Dave. Ryan, I really like that David was talking about community there. I wonder if you could speak to what's happening in Alberta for us.
Yeah, absolutely. So let me just make sure that I have my thing presenting here and that everyone can see it okay. Oops. Okay, how's that?
That's good.
Cool. So yeah, first of all, thank you for having me. Happy St. Paddy's Day, everybody. I'm really excited to be here, and I'm really glad that people are sort of actively talking about esports. As someone who works for the Alberta Esports Association, obviously it's something that I'm very passionate about. And actually, as everyone else was just talking there, I had to really reel myself in between like trying to jump out and talk to, about a billion things there. So I'll give some context basically about where esports has been in Alberta, where we're at now, and kind of where we want to go moving forward. So where we've been over the last 15 years or so has been a very sort of grassroots community-led esports activities. You can see I've got that little sort of cowboy hat there in 2005 because the analogy that I like to use right now is it's a bit of a Wild West. over the last 15 years, people have been doing things at a very, like I said, grassroots level, small communities, student clubs at universities, things of that nature, right? By the way, all these pictures here are from events that have happened here locally in Alberta, whether it's Calgary or Edmonton. So yeah, it's been very amateur, but there's been a tremendous amount of participants and interest in the activity. So one of the things I actually wanted to talk about in reference to the golf course situation that David Finch was talking about, not only do people, when they play these games, play basically in the same arena, but because there's very little sort of infrastructure support for some of these pro players. If you wanted to be pro, you would literally have to go to each one of these little individual events and get as much practice and as much notoriety as you can. So not only are they playing in the same digital arena as the professional players, right? But these community members are often literally playing with these pro players, which is really, really cool. So that just talks about the sort of community aspect. The reason why I have pre-COVID there is because COVID was really a bit of a catalyst for activating or for creating the Alberta Esports Association. Before, like I said, it was very fragmented. But since COVID happened, we really decided, okay, this is something that we can actually turn into a formal organization and start building some infrastructure and some support for these communities who actually want to develop an ecosystem here. So along the community front, and this is to address some of those sort of health and wellness issues that David Legg was talking about, but this is an example of some of the things that we had going on at an event in February to address some of those inclusivity and health and wellness issues. So on the left there, you see a panel that we had about women in leadership, particularly in technology and gaming, really trying to bring some focus to that. And then on the right, we had sort of movement breaks throughout the broadcast of our event. It was a weekend long. And so that's Kristen, our health and wellness manager, making sure people every once in a while stand up, stretch, get some water, that kind of thing. And we also actually have a lot of initiatives going on specifically to address health and wellness of gamers in Alberta. So we're partnered with the Sleep Center, the Sleep Research Center of Calgary, for example. We have some partnerships with clinical psychologists and sports psychologists, some fitness studios, stuff like that, right? Because what we're really trying to do is not just approach this from the sort of business case of having esports and supporting these communities, but also to legitimately improve the health of these communities, because myself and the rest of our team are part of those communities, right? So in terms of how we engage with the industry, as I said, in Alberta, we are still fairly grassroots. Since our inception in last year in the spring, around the same time the pandemic shut everything down, we've seen a tremendous amount of progress. But again, we're really approaching it from a community building approach, a sort of ground up approach. So in terms of engaging some of those more major teams, publishers, events, we do have some pretty large events, but it's still very grassroots. So, but this kind of shows you a breakdown of that governance structure that does exist or is trying to get to start existing, as David Finch was saying. So there's the Global Esports Federation that obviously is an international sort of governing body. The Canadian Esports Association was recently founded as that sort of next step down, and then obviously here to us in Alberta. So one of the interesting things about that actually is that the Global Esports Federation is one of two global international esports governing bodies. And so there's a little bit of competition there and confusion, but that obviously is one of those issues that David Finch was talking about how to make sure that there's sort of consistent policy and infrastructure for the growth of esports. So one other thing I do really want to point out though about this is that there are plenty of other esports associations provincially across Canada, but we're the only one in Alberta that's actually recognized by the Canadian Esports Association. And the reason why is because we're approaching it from supporting the communities and building the infrastructure for the industry. We're really trying to create an ecosystem. So going back to David Finch's last couple slides as well, there's a tremendous amount of different components that need to be in place to have a successful and healthy esports ecosystem. And so that's something that we're working on. Some of the other places in Canada are really more focusing on the business case side of things. So whether it's building a stadium, hosting a tournament series or leagues, whatever it might be. Obviously, that's very important, but that's just one piece. So when it comes to the rest of Canada, we're actually a little bit ahead in terms of developing the industry, but we're also a little bit further behind when it comes to content. And so an example of that is in Vancouver, the Aquilini Group, who is a major sports group, they own the Vancouver Titans, which is an Overwatch League team, which is basically, the top tier of that particular game. Likewise, in Toronto, there's the Overactive Media Group, which is the group that's building the new stadium there. I'm not sure if anyone's familiar with it, but a couple of weeks ago they announced it. And it's like a $500 million esports stadium, something like that, right? And they also have a team, the Overactive Media Group also have a team, the Toronto Defiant. So, again, in terms of content, they're pretty far ahead, but, we're doing really well in terms of actually building the infrastructure to have that scale up. And then in terms of academics, this is one of the most important pieces here, but we've seen a tremendous amount of engagement in esports from the academic side of things here in Alberta. So obviously you've got Mount Royal, right? We're here having this talk. Brad Mahon, right, started the Esports Management Certificate last semester, which has been really, really fantastic. SAIT we've been working with, and the ACAC, which is the Alberta Colleges Athletics Conference, they actually govern all of the colleges' athletics programming throughout Alberta. So that's 17 different schools that we're actually working with right now to bring esports into their athletic programming. The really cool thing about that is that we're not just approaching it from a sort of athletics point of view, the way that you might with traditional sports, but we're also tying into other faculties like broadcasting and media studies, right? Having students engaged not just as players, but also having them volunteer in hosting some of the events, broadcasting, literally commentating and stuff. So there's been a tremendous amount of interest that way. This last symbol here at the bottom is the symbol that we recently started with the Edmonton Public School Board. So literally right now, actually last weekend and this weekend, we have a tournament series with the Edmonton Public School Board being championed by basically a committee of different teachers to start having esports formally recognized at the junior high and high school level. So this event that I'm talking about has, I believe it's 22 different schools and over 140 different students that are engaged in this throughout the junior high and high school level. So that just gives you a good sense of how much engagement there is at the academic level and how much opportunity there is for that as well. And one of the things that I really want to focus on here is that it's not just about getting kids to play video games and engage in it at the sort of sports level. But it also introduces them to the world of STEM, right? And one of the stories, one of the co-founders for ASA is actually a civil engineer, and one of the stories that he always likes to say is, everybody who works in STEM is a nerd in some way, right? And I think that's very true. So, for example, we had a discussion with Eric Watsky from the Westwind School District, and he was talking about creating an esports club and athletic program in the rural district down in southern Alberta. And a kid came to him and he said, "Hey, I really like I really like Minecraft. Can we do a Minecraft thing?" And Eric said, "Well, I mean, yeah, sure. I don't know. I don't know how to set that up in a sort of competitive sense because Minecraft is kind of a creative game, right?" And the kids, so he's like, "Yeah, if you can figure something out, we can try to make something happen, right?" And the kid's like, "Okay, sure, yeah, I'll build a world and I'll create some rules and a game set and blah blah blah, right?" And this kid was 9 years old. So the cool thing about that is that these kids aren't literally just logging in and playing a video game. It's giving them an opportunity to have some ownership and responsibility and really engage in the sort of technology side of things. So the academic piece is really, really cool. So this last slide here is basically talking about what it takes to go from the sort of grassroots to the professional scene. And on the right, there's the only picture that is not from our events, because obviously we are not in Las Vegas. But these are all the sort of little pieces, again, reflecting David Finch's slide about what is required to have a healthy ecosystem. So you can see some of those check marks actually have a little tilde next to them. So what that means basically is things that have sort of started, but are not necessarily there yet. So in terms of industry leaders, the Alberta Esports Association is doing really well on that front, but we don't necessarily have a lot of engagement from the industry at large as of yet. What we really need to do is create more attraction for some of those bigger esports companies that already exist, to create some anchor companies or teams to start coming here to Calgary for the rest of the industry to sort of rally around. In terms of tournaments, leagues, and events, we do have a lot of major events and a lot of minor events as well. But what we really need to do is start building out some high tier, high performance competitive leagues that the best players around the world can sort of start seeing and start competing in, and really create that pipeline of talent for the best players to sort of come to the front. In terms of associations, like I said, there's already the global, Canadian, and provincial association. So that's actually probably the most progress we've made so far, although there is still a lot of cohesion that needs to happen between the other provinces and ourselves as well, making sure that it's consistent throughout the nation. And then education and talent development, like I said, is very, there's a lot of buy-in, there's a lot of interest, but there's still a lot more that needs to be done, whether it's creating more programs, more engagement at the athletic level, scholarships, really creating a pipeline for students to engage in esports and sort of take that all the way through their education, whether it's as a player or whether they want to go into it in a different career path. So the venues is a very important thing as well, right? Talking about stadiums. We don't have any dedicated stadiums right now in Alberta, although there's a lot of sort of talks about it. It's important to note that we need more than just a big major event stadium as well. But we also need things that community users can sort of engage with, right? So similar to how any community center will have a basketball court or maybe a hockey rink in the winter, right? We need places where the community can kind of go and engage with it in a little bit more affordability, a little bit more accessibility. Government support comes in a lot of different ways, right? But in terms of sort of funding, creating a favorable business environment for some of that private investment and industry support to grow. And yeah, that's pretty much where we're at this point. But yeah, so thank you.
Thanks so much, Ryan. We're going to jump to Brad Mahon, who's going to let us know what we can do in those and what Mount Royal is doing in that realm of kind of like the education and talent development piece.
Yeah, thanks so much, Carrie, and thanks, Anna. I was mentioning earlier before we started the being called to an expert panel on emerging technology and not knowing how to share my own screen. So thanks, Anna, for driving that for me. Maybe just to put this into context, I just wanted to talk a little bit about continuing education as a faculty and what our mandate is, and I think it'll help folks understand how esports fits with that. We often consider ourselves to be really an outward-facing faculty, lots of connection to industry through work-integrated learning opportunities, and through our instructors. It is typical for us to have instructors teach our courses who have a full-time job out in the private sector or in industry, and often then they're coming in and they're teaching a course or two for us and bringing that professional experience in for our students. Speaking of our students, typically our students are working. Most of our students are sort of mid-career professionals. It's a typical continuing education student that we have at Mount Royal. 74% of our students have a university credential already, so they're coming back. The hashtags we use are, career enhancement, career change, career pivot, those kinds of things. So, and the other point I'll say about continuing education to set this up is that we're a revenue generating unit. So we are charged with paying our bills, paying our salaries and returning a profit, a surplus profit target back to the university. So the early conversations that we were having about esports really happened with our event and conference folks and our information technology people, our ITS. And they were talking about some esports events that were happening on campus. And I think this was in 2019, maybe the summer or the fall of 2019. And there was a discussion about, have you heard of this esports? We're having these events on campus, lots of participants, lots of money, which of course made my eyes light up. Raised as an artist, I die a little when I say that, but it is part of our world. I did a little bit of research and I kept seeing the words billion-dollar industry. And And then I started thinking, David Finch mentioned it earlier. I also have a teenage son, and I started connecting all the dots about the hours of playing. His friends would come over for a sleepover. They'd bring their own flat screen TVs. All the boys were in the living room with their own TVs, engaged in these games. Dad, we need better internet. So really for us though in continuing education, we came to it with the lens of esports as a sector. And we wanted to, again, going back to what our typical students are, how do we help people enter that sector and seek some kind of employment or seek some kind of career? So it really reinforced our identity, again, the connection to industry, helping learners advance their careers. Our value proposition to the students really was, to kind of make that transition from perhaps being the participant or from gaming to having some kind of involvement in the management of it, turning your interest into a career and being part of that ecosystem, right? So really what we were looking to do in this program is to give folks some acumen that they could enter this industry in some way. Anna, can we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. So, one of the things that we work to do really in continuing education is we try to move very quickly and be flexible, nimble, responsive. And one of the ways that we've done that is through partnerships. We've developed programs where not only do we offer them at Mount Royal, but we have partner organizations throughout Alberta and beyond who license those programs from us. And we also have programs that come in, and we wanted to move very quickly with esports. And from the conversations going back that we had with our event people and our information technology folks, I think it was December 2019. In February, we had a conversation with University of California, Irvine. They had already developed a certificate program. It was online. It was working. We had a coffee date with them in that February of 2020. March came, of course, the world shut down. April, we met the parents. We signed the deal. We said, we're going to do this, right? We took our relationship to another level. May, we went public. We announced that we were going to launch this program. June, we opened registration. And then this last September, we had our first cohort. So, in less than a year, we went from initial conversation to actually having students in the virtual classroom. And that's really what we wanted. And that was the advantage to going with UC Irvine. A little bit about the information. It's 4 courses. They're all entirely online. I'll run them through our learning management system, which is Blackboard. So we basically got their robots talking to our robots, and we were able to kind of figure out how that all worked. Each certificate is 30 hours, about 30 hours of online time or instruction for 120 hours in total. There is a live element each week where the instructor, has a posted lecture, gets up and actually, has that Zoom meeting or through Google Meets. So a little bit more about the program details. Maybe we'll jump ahead to the next slide, please, Anna. Thank you. There's a little bit more detail about the courses, and these are all online. If you go onto our Mount Royal University Continuing Education website and look up esports, there's a lot of details about the program. It'll kind of walk you through all the different learning outcomes, the things that you kind of want to know. But I have to say, one of the things about this is we had to say to folks, this isn't about becoming a better gamer. We had to explain that to people. We weren't teaching people how to get a higher score. We had to really show that, what we're doing is we're really teaching that business side of things. And when you look at the courses that we're offering, these are usual topics in business: marketing and communications, project management, operations in terms of human resources, organizational infrastructure, but looking at it through the esports lens. So helping people who maybe have a marketing and communications background do that career pivot into esports, etc. I see we're kind of running low, a little out of time here, so let me just jump to talk a little bit about the future of esports in terms of where it might be going with Mount Royal. I think one of the things you can see from the conversation today is we're really poised. There's so much great synergy on campus. We've heard from 3 of our faculty members who are really leaders in the field of esports in terms of being thought leaders, in terms of the research and scholarship and driving that. We've got interest from our events and our information technology. We've got student clubs on campus. We've had conversation with our varsity sports teams. We've even had conversations with our fundraising folks about what is the potential for sponsorship with this if we were to bring in a team. Of course, we've got support from our library as seen today, and thanks again for that. Our senior administration at the university is very excited about all of this activity that's happening. So the future is really bright. And so I think for us, the next stage is knowing that all of this positive energy is happening. How do we focus it all? How do we kind of come together and move forward? Because I think there's an opportunity for Mount Royal to continue to be a leader in this field. Maybe I'll stop there. Thanks, Carrie.
That's a lovely place to end our presentations, Brad. Thank you so much for that. I don't think we have any questions in the chat, but if anybody would like to turn on their mic, if you've got some comments or things that you'd like to add to the conversation, I do recognize we have 1 minute left. We can stay a little bit after, but for those of you that can't stay past 1 o'clock, we thank you all very much for joining us today. We will continue the recording, so if you wanted to catch up on the end, we'll continue the recording and you can find that on our YouTube channel. So feel free if anybody's got any questions.
I've got one. I'll lower my hand here. First of all, I just want to thank all the presenters. I thought, what a fantastic job. It's so nice to know, really within our own four walls, the level of knowledge that we already have. My question really pertains to, are there other schools, specifically in the post-secondary environment, who are really doing this well from a business perspective? We talked a lot about we know infrastructure costs and IT costs and a lot of support that's going to be required, but are there other schools out there that you're aware of that have done this well? And are there business models out there or a business canvas that you know of that we could tap into just to explore this a little bit further?
I know David Finch has had to leave, but maybe Brad, you could speak to that?
Sure. No, absolutely happy to. One of the things that we've been doing is, and I see that I'm not sure if Chad is still on, is on the call, but we've had some conversations with St. Clair College in Ontario was one place that we had a conversation with, because actually, to Jason's point, we thought, well, let's look across Canada and even into the US, but let's look across Canada and say, who else is doing this? And we're really interested in how do we build the internal infrastructure? What do the club teams need to go to another level? What would a varsity sports team need? And we're having the conversations with those people. We don't want to talk about them like they're not in the room. We're going to those folks and saying, you know, because we don't know. And that was part of the conversation with University Advancement, you know, just putting it on their radar and saying, this thing is growing. There's a lot of excitement. Just put it in all the advancement officers, development officers' brain, just to say, just keep that in mind, that we're looking at ways to expand this. And if you're having, as they're out in the community having conversations, or virtual conversations, I guess these days, but as they're talking to folks, to keep that in mind. So yeah, Jason, I mean, that's it. I mean, it's it's a, rather than kind of reinventing things, are there other schools? And I'll just say as a final comment on that, what we have found in those very early conversations is that folks are so willing to tell you everything they know. The fellow from St. Clair College, we had a meeting with him. He made a PowerPoint for the meeting for us. You know, I mean, he was, because we kind of joked. He said, "Hey, we got a team. We look forward to beating you." You know, there was all of a sudden we're trash talking each other, and so it was great. And you realize that we're all building this thing together. We're all excited about it, and I think we're all kind of rowing in the right direction. So yeah, great camaraderie amongst the participants.
I'll open it up if anybody else has insights to add.
Thanks, Brad.
Thank you. Are there any other questions or comments that people would like to share?
I'm just going to speak up again, because that's what I do. Again, I thought there was really two really great points that were raised that even I didn't even realize, and I've looked at this a little bit. But Brad, when you were talking really about, and I believe it was you, Brad, talking about this male-dominant profession and talking about the misogyny and the homophobic conversation, the racism, the bullying, it really breaks my heart to hear those kinds of things. And I'm wondering, are there strategies in place to try to eliminate that? I wouldn't, I mean, in an online environment, people hide behind their computer screens. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about that. And just my second part, and I want to comment to David Legg. I love the fact when you talked about the different physical abilities, and this bring into the community, that this opens it up for so many more people beyond just sports. So thanks for mentioning that. I think that's just a critical piece. So Brad, I'm just wondering if you can talk about that male dominant and where that's going.
Sure, and you know, I think even in Ryan's presentation, there was recognition of work to be done, and people are doing the work. One of the famous initiatives in the esports world has been AnyKey, which has a organizational heft behind it that has tried to improve mostly gender diversity in esports. I think one of the challenges, is the anonymity that does come with being behind a screen, and it's typically the Twitch chat where a lot of the abuse happens. I've talked to people who are heavily involved in different capacities with different Twitch channels, and one thing they say to me is that the moderators are often overwhelmed, that they just can't keep up. So there are when people put on tournaments locally or big, there's moderation strategies in place to speak to some of this, but it is challenging, and I think I still think that the industry broadly, the gaming industry, needs to be a little bit more upfront and transparent about the issues we have. We just saw that one of the big sponsors for Riot Games has pulled out, and it's all over issues around diversity and kind of a toxic work environment at Riot Games, and allegations around abuse at the hands of their CEO. And when I look at what's occurred through the pandemic and with Black Lives Matter and the racial reckoning, organizations have tried to really own their involvement in that. And I look at media a lot. For example, the Winnipeg Free Press issued a statement saying they apologized. Like they went over what they did bad in the past and tried to rectify it. The LA Times did a huge thing just like that as well. And I think when you do that, you start clean and people trust you at least. So, I'd like to see the industry maybe take some steps like that as well. And lots of people are working really hard to do that. I don't want to come across as entirely negative, but it still is a challenge, and not just for esports, but in society too.
Thanks, Brad. And sorry, I didn't want to exclude Ryan from that comment, because I really appreciate what you're doing with Esports Alberta, Ryan. I thought the fact that you did raise that, and some of the stuff that you're doing for that, you mean gender parity and stuff, I think that's wonderful. So I just want to make that comment too.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. I really appreciate that. And actually, to expand on Brad's point a little bit, there are some real issues in gaming and esports. I'm not going to lie about that. There can be really bad toxicity and everything. So one of the things that we did, above and beyond making sure that we have a lot of representation, inclusivity. I think inclusivity is one of our core values, actually. So it's very important to us. One of the first things that we did when we were founded at the beginning of last summer is create a code of conduct and a set of policies and regulations for everybody that we work with. And we did that in response to a lot of allegations coming up in some very specific gaming communities throughout North America. There was a lot of controversy that came up, and we said, okay, you know what, we're going to take a stand, and we're going to make sure that we lead the way in what we do. So these policies are things that we have spread out through all of the communities that we're partnered with throughout other provinces as well, really trying to address some of those issues. But it is something that we really try to live up to. Our board of directors, for example, is equally split between men and women, right? We really want to make sure that we have that. So, but you're right. I think the biggest issue is the anonymity, right? If you're at a Flames game or whatever and you beak off too much, there's always the threat of getting punched in the face, right? Whereas when you're behind a keyboard, nobody can do that to you, really. The most they can do is maybe ban your account for 10 minutes on the game, right? So yeah, it is a really big issue, but the industry is slowly moving forward. I think, like Brad said, that admission and recognition piece about where things have gone wrong in the past and just trying to be open and transparent about it is the right way forward. I'm obviously connected very well, on LinkedIn or whatever with the industry, and I see a lot of movement towards, more women, more people of color, more minority representation and everything, which is great. But at the end of the day, it's a slow going thing.
If I could just add on that, it's David Finch, Ryan. One of the realities on the business side is this creates the ceiling of the potential business opportunity, because as we've seen in other sports over the last 5 years, the power of corporate partners and sponsors is enormous, and they will not be associated with anything that will have a negative impact on their brand equity. The reason you partner sponsor with an organization is you want to borrow their halo and brand equity, not the other way around from a liability perspective. So the other dimension is also the governance challenge, because there's no unified governing body, though there are attempts to create mechanisms to mitigate this, that fragmented governing body as challenges. But on the flip side, the publishers have enormous power as well, and through partnerships with corporate funders and so forth, they can simply just turn people off. And frankly, we saw that with Twitter, on January 6th. When you own a platform, there isn't a whole lot of checks and balances. If you go and say, you know what, that person's out, and it's literally, they're just out, as opposed to if you look in traditional sports leagues where there's massive processes. Just look at the IOC and the Olympics, where there's years after years of appeals and arbitration. There isn't in esports. It's somebody owns the league, somebody owns the platform. If you don't align with their policies and rules and brand, you are simply done. And one of the challenges and the reality of this, and Brian, you could talk to this more than I can, is we have to think of esports and the professional aspect of it as a very, very specialized skill set. It's not like, if you look at other high performance sports, very few people can play in the NHL and then say, you know what, I feel like playing baseball next year. That just doesn't happen. It also doesn't happen in esports. There are very few people that can pivot, because you spend years literally developing that expertise in Overwatch. It's not like on a whim you can just say, once you get banned from Overwatch, you're going to go to another platform. It's just simply not that easy. So there are a lot of checks and balances from a business place, but it's going to be a ceiling until this course corrects itself.
Yeah, I would agree. I think you're totally right about that. And one of the problems too, when we talk about the sort of accessibility of content, is how easy it is for people to get onto a platform like Twitch, for example. So I'm not going to name names, but there is a player in the Overwatch League from the first year who was a very prominent personality. He was a very good player, and he streamed on his off time, just as a personality, right? Not as necessarily a player. And he got 3 strikes and then eventually banned and fined quite a bit of money as well from the Overwatch League because of things that he was saying on his personal stream, right? And so he's no longer part of the Overwatch League, which is all well and good, but he still pulls in 30,000 people watching him on Twitch when he games, and he's a personality that's fairly aggressive and does a lot of the yelling and swearing and whatever, right? But you're totally right. I mean, there's a certain amount of ownership from the sponsors to make sure that the money doesn't go to people who don't necessarily deserve it. We see a lot of issues in that when we talk about sponsorships, and particularly with schools, about who's willing to sponsor what, especially when some of these video games can be a little bit violent. So you're right. There's a lot of nuance there, for sure.
I just want to jump into some of the bit of the conversation that's happening in the chat. Denise, did that conversation there respond to your question? Denise's question was, are there fines or sanctions in place for the pros like in other professional sports? There's also a question with regards to conversations about with industry. And Ryan, you responded to that. I wondered if you wanted to add a little bit with regards to the conversations that you're having with Calgary Economic Development.
Yeah, so we are currently talking with constituents from the city of Calgary, as well as Calgary Economic Development, as well as Western Economic Diversification. There's a lot of interest and intrigue, right? But these conversations are kind of ongoing, and they're still pretty early stages. So a lot of it comes down to building the business case for supporting it, right? Where does the money come from? Who benefits from it? That kind of thing. And so there are some moves forward in that for sure, but I I can't really say too much more than that.
Thank you.
And
Early
Terry,
days.
I'll just comment on the sanctions. So,
Thanks.
there are enormous sanctions because of the control of the publishers, control of the leagues. One of my interesting when we were studying the NBA Y2K, as you could imagine, the NBA 2K league is, you screw with that, you screw with the NBA brand, right? So there's a non-negotiable. So you look at the protocols they use to select their teams, because there's the draft. And you could imagine that filtering process, which includes personal interviews and codes of conduct for players to sanction, start rolling down from the top X thousand to just to be on the draft list. You have to have incredible integrity. They look at everything, as Ryan said, from a social and personal, because the minute you are on an NBA 2K team, you are part of the NBA family, right? So there is arguably greater control on the esports side of the NBA, frankly, than there is on the traditional NBA side in regards to kind of player obligation, performance, and codes of conduct.
That's great. Thank you, David. We have a question from Juan. He says, what efforts are there right now from MRU about finding out about what esports are active at Mount Royal, referring mostly to clubs? Is anybody familiar with any of the clubs that exist on campus?
Brad Mahon actually would have been the best person for this, but I guess he left. So we are actively working with Mount Royal on sort of formalizing their esports activations. Club Nerd right now, I believe, is kind of leading the charge on that, as well as Chad from the athletics department. I'm not sure if Chad would want to speak up to it, but he might be able to say a little bit more than I could. But we are actively working with Mount Royal on that front.
Thanks, Ryan. Chad.
Yeah, I can maybe jump on. Kind of as was mentioned, what's quickly evolved as an opportunity for athletics and recreation to dive into this has quickly expanded in a good way to have all these. So pretty much everyone on the call I've had separate conversations with, or we have as a group, to decide really how can we serve the university as a whole, rather than what's sort of been happening up till now, where it's been pockets of people doing different things or different organizations doing different things. So what comes with that is a big challenge of trying to streamline this group and decide how we can best serve the university. So Club Nerd is really one of the SAMRU clubs that's being present right now, and they do compete separate from the institution, but how can we streamline this process and make it a win-win-win across the board from a competition standpoint, from a viewing standpoint, from a business standpoint, and trying to build that case of what that can look like at Mount Royal University.
Thanks. One, you could have a look at the SAMRU website. You'll be able to find the clubs there too if you're looking for Club Nerd. Did I get it right?
Yeah, and I'll actually expand on that just a little bit too, not specifically with MRU, but this is one of the complications that we see when we're dealing with post-secondary institutions, is that there's often a student club component. There's often, especially with esports, right, an athletics component, and then there's also sort of an academic component to it. So like Chad was saying, things can be very sort of fragmented. Things happen in these little sort of pockets, right? So we've seen that in a lot of post-secondary institutions that we've been talking about. It's just one of the sort of realities of trying to build this up, right?
Thanks. We have a question from Mark for David and Brad. Brad had to leave, so David, it's your question. With having already written a book on esports, where do you see your involvement with esports at MRU and Calgary, Alberta community going forward?
Well, I can't. I'll say that Brad or David Finch are going to take all the work on this. So since I get to speak first, when I started the book writing process, in part it was because I teach in sport and recreation management, and I teach in adaptive physical activity, and I had seen that esport was something that I needed to adapt to, something that I needed to understand better myself, because it was certainly of interest to my students. And so, the Darwinian theory of it's not the strongest of the species that survives, but it's the one that's able to adapt. And so as a faculty member, I thought, well, I'd better adapt myself and figure out what this is, so that I can speak to it, help my students understand it, and allow them to be better prepared for when they, kind of hit the ground running after they graduate. So I would say I am certainly committed to continuing being involved in it as an interested observer, and certainly, someone who I think speaks to it positively, and someone who speaks to it as a potential opportunity. From my adapted physical activity perspective, so sport and recreation for people with disabilities, I really see this as a tremendous growth opportunity for engaging people with disabilities to interact with their peers. There's some fantastic television commercials done by Microsoft and Xbox that, I think demonstrate to me anyways, that possibility of that encouraging a sense of belonging and inclusiveness through technology to participate. And so again, from that side of things, I will certainly remain involved as well.
And I'll just comment. When I took the same approach as David, as a sports marketing person, in which we started seeing the partners we work with trying to figure out their place and position on it from a traditional sport perspective. I think there's an enormous opportunity for Calgary. So I'm involved in, and David and I were deeply involved in what was called the Active City Collective. That's looking at the entire active ecosystem and the opportunities it can bring the region as a whole. And I'm currently engaged with Calgary Economic Development and Calgary Arts Development. We're developing a creative economy strategy for the entire region as well. And we're looking at the collision of these opportunities. This is a personal example of, so my son, who wants to be, get involved professionally from a video game design perspective. He's a script writer. He was a student at MRU. He's now at U of T. He has no choice but to go to Vancouver, period. He's going to the Vancouver Film School next fall because he's leaving the city, because there are no local options for him in this area. And that's problematic, as that sucking sound pulls people out of the city if there's no viable a professional pathway or learning pathways for people to develop professionally. So this is something that I think is a huge opportunity, but we've got to get serious about it sooner than later.
Yeah, and that was what drew me into the book project initially too. Was I was starting to have students who are really interested in broadcast careers related to esports, and the more I started to look at it, the more promise I saw as another business opportunity for media practitioners, for media investors, and that just really got me going in it. And because I do focus on diversity and inclusion in my research, I do sort of follow the esports world to see how they're handling it as well.
Thank you. We have another comment question in the chat. JN, I wonder if you would like to expand on that, on the research project that you're working on right now. I'm inviting you to ask your own question if you would prefer. Okay, I will read it just in case they don't have a microphone available. So the question is, how do you see esports communities continue to work? I'm doing my own research project right now, and there seems to be a general sense that players do not feel as part of the larger and broader esports or individual competitive game title community. Rather, micro communities are often considered more important. How would you keep building on that? Events, arenas, working in more localized development? No.
I was going to say, I guess that's probably mostly my area, but yeah. So I think you're right in that there is definitely a disconnect between the sort of grassroots community level and the sort of high tier professional level of esports. I think a big part of that is seeing the again, that sort of pipeline of what it takes to move from, someone who just plays games casually to becoming a professional player, right? So in hockey, for example, right? If you were a kid, you wanted to become a pro hockey player, you could go into, you know, U12, U14, play at your high school, play at your university, and or juniors or whatever it happens to be, and then sort of get into that sort of high tier level of competition. In esports, it's a lot less structured, right? And so that's one of the things that we're trying to help establish, is sort of build that pipeline of talent development. But without it there, it's really hard to see where the individual player from a community connects to the larger industry as a whole. And obviously, part of that too is actually having more local representation of that top tier industry talent, right? So, for example, if you lived in Vancouver, it might be a little bit easier for you because you can see that the Vancouver Titans exist, right? They have their own professional esports team. Whereas if you're in Calgary, you just feel like there's nothing, right? So representation sort of at that localized level, I think, is really important, and also seeing that pipeline to success.
And I'll just add on to that. The other kind of dimension of esports, which I think has to be understood, is there's really no such thing as esports. Just like when you look at more macro level sports, you've got hockey, you've got cricket, you've got handball, you've got swimming, and they are not one community. And that's certainly one thing David and I, over the last 2 years with the Active City Collective, were involved in. The people who canoe have very little in common with the people who luge, and the people who play handball. They have nothing in common, and so the opportunity to be looking at the bridges there from a system perspective is enormous. Trying to move some of the key social and physical infrastructure opportunities move forward as a whole. But again, esports is composed of a variety of different genres that have little interaction with one another, and people tend to stay in their genres to a great extent, just like they do in traditional sport. The golfer is not necessarily hanging out with the beach volleyball player, and so that's got to be recognized as well. That's why the concept of esports is even difficult to talk about, because we don't do that in traditional sports.
Would that be one of the challenges of being able to tie together all the three aspects of collegiate esports programs? Just speaking to a question we have in the chat here from Walter. So thinking about the varsity competition, the student engagement, and the academic tie-in, is that one of the challenges where the communities are all more fragmented and specialized?
No, I don't. I'm trying to think aloud now. Like, if you look at traditional varsity sports, we obviously have a variety of different sports, and I'm not sure how much interaction the Cougar hockey teams have with the volleyball players or the golf team. But they're all still part of the Cougar family. So I think, ironically, and Ryan, you probably comment on that. Ironically, a varsity environment is probably the one place where, in fact, they will have some bridging, because they have that commonality of the varsity family, whereas many other situations that just doesn't exist.
Yeah, and so I've got a couple things to say about that. So at the competitive level, David, you're right that people don't necessarily, like athletes, don't necessarily move between different genres. But at the casual level, people who play video games will usually play all kinds of games, right? And so when it comes to sort of engagement at the casual level, what we've seen is that students, whether it's a high school or a post-secondary institution, engages with esports, students are just happy that there's video games, period. They're like, heck yeah, I've grown up playing video games. Oh, you're playing this game? I'll do that. You have this event? I'll go to that too, right? So at the casual level, people are a lot more willing to engage with it, almost regardless of what the game itself is. To a certain extent, of course, obviously some games are more popular, right, than others, but as far as sort of successes in tying together those three different components, I think the biggest thing is just that it highlights where all the opportunity is, right? You can create educational programs for these things. You can drive enrollment, right, by having these things. You can have an athletics program, right? It creates this sort of synergy there. So the biggest success is just that people and institutions are starting to recognize that this is a real thing that they should be paying attention to.
Thanks, Ryan. We have a question from Sarah, who says, "Hello, I work in esports startup in Tunisia. What do you think of the esports ecosystem in MENA region, and what kind of opportunities exist?"
I don't know if anyone else would like to field this question, but personally, I'm not super familiar with the MENA region too much. I know that a lot of fighting games are very popular there, particularly Tekken. There's one really, really prominent player who I want to say is from Afghanistan, but don't quote me on that. And he came out just like, within a year of playing the game, he's like the best in the world. So he's a bit of a champion there. But I know that there's a lot of growth there, and I know that it's sort of coming up very fast, but otherwise I don't actually know that much about the region.
Without making too many assumptions, because I don't have a terrific line of sight, but I would think that mobile gaming in particular might be a fruitful source of development in some parts of that area, and I just in some of my research, I've just read very generally that there does seem to be a growing interest for esports and gaming in the region.
Sarah, would you like to share some insights that you have? It might be useful for us to know.
Yes, thank you all. So this is Sarah from Tunisia. Honestly, we work on a startup. What we do is that we organize tournaments with mobile operators, because game publisher, let's say like Garena or Activision Blizzard and everything, they don't have, let's say, a payment model. So we do with operators. So we organize tournaments, let's say for Free Fire, which is very popular here in Tunisia, or PUBG or Call of Duty Mobile. And people who enter the tournament need to be subscribed to the operators. Currently, we are monopole in Tunisia. Our tournaments have been really successful. Players are just waiting for something official, for people to enter the market, because there is no one doing anything in esports ecosystem, let's say, in the North African region. So now we are basically also expanding to Libya, which is, let's say, a black box really in this. And we also try to sell in-game currency, because we have problem of PayPal and Visa card. They're not allowed in these region, especially in the north, let's say, not in the Middle East. And we try to sell them in a legal way, official way, with partnership with the game publishers. So yes, it's a very promising, let's say, it's very promising in the future. Esports is really growing, and people, when they just listen, there is a tournament, they just subscribe and they want to be in.
Thanks so much for sharing that with us.
Thank you.
Does anybody have any questions for Sarah?
I don't necessarily have any questions, but I would congratulate you on your efforts in trying to sort of capitalize on the opportunity there. You say that there's not really anyone else doing that, so that's fantastic. And that's kind of the same thing that we did here, is that yes, there was a lot of grassroots operations going on, but nobody was actually trying to formalize it. And so we took advantage of that as well. So I would just say congratulations and keep on it. And I'm already sending you a message on LinkedIn, and we can connect about it later.
Thank you so much, of course.
That's great. That's all we have for questions and comments in the chat, and we're a half an hour over our time. So obviously there's more room to continue this conversation, I think. Thank you to everybody for joining us. If you have more questions, feel free to reach out to the panelists who so graciously shared their time with us today, and the experts that we have. Thank you all for joining us. We really appreciate the conversation that we've had today.
Thanks, Carrie and Anna, and thanks everybody for listening to us today.
Thanks all. Bye-bye.
Thanks as well.